I'm Nikki from the Oak Ridges Moraine Land Trust, and I also have Aileen here with me in case my rural internet cuts out. We protect land across the Oak Ridges Moraine. So we would like to start off by acknowledging that we are on the traditional territories of the Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, and the Anishinaabe peoples, whose presence here continues to this day. We would also like to acknowledge the land we are on as the meeting place of two treaties, the lands of the Mississaugas of the Credit and those of the First Nations of the Williams Treaties. We thank them and other Indigenous peoples for sharing this land with us. We would also like to acknowledge the Chippewas of Georgina Island First Nations as our closest Indigenous community. We acknowledge this land and the people because the first step to reconciliation is recognizing the existence of Indigenous people. A shared understanding of how our collective past brought us to where we are today will help us walk together into a better future. We give deep gratitude to the Indigenous peoples of these lands who have been stewards of this land since time immemorial. The Oak Ridges Moraine Land Trust endeavors to honor this land and its treaties by strengthening our relationship and responsibilities to them. And always, I just want to say thank you for taking part in this land acknowledgement with us. It's really important to stay mindful of not only the words that we are saying, but what they mean and what they mean to generations and generations of people. So if you don't know, the Oak Ridges Moraine itself is a geological feature that was created 13,000 years ago during the Ice Age, and it's covered in unique habitat for at-risk species, as well as being a source of fresh water. If you don't know much about where this feature is located, it's actually, it crosses a large portion of local region from east to west, shown here, from Peel all the way to Northumberland. Here are some additional stats about the moraine, which include unique water habitats. Additionally, 90% of the moraine is actually under private ownership, which is sort of where we come in. The Trust is a registered charity with the goal of protecting natural environments forever. We are a registered charity that works to ensure a healthy ecosystem and natural environment that thrives forever on and adjacent to the Oak Ridges Moraine. Over 60 properties are under our management, and we're excited to keep expanding that. Here are some of our properties. It's not a complete list of them or a complete map of them, but as you can see, we're all spread out. Our boundaries can cross the Oak Ridges Moraine. Again, we're just trying to protect as much as we can. And one of our programs that we use is called the Ecological Gifts Program, which federally protects land forever. Landowners leave a legacy for future generations and also get a significant tax benefit when they donate land or do a conservation easement. We also do outreach and education programs. It's a big part of what we do. This is an example of one of our webinars, and we're just really excited that we were able to continue this even throughout the pandemic. It's been a really great learning experience for everyone. We do have some upcoming free ones, so webinars, guided or self-guided walks, Biolympics, and more throughout the summer. Some of the ones coming up in the next month are Wild About Bees, which is happening next week. We're doing a spring break pentathlon, so that will be 5 days of fun, usually about 1 to 2 hours per day to compete in 5 different competitions. We've also got Winged Wonders, which is all about bats of Ontario, and the fungi of the moraine, so that'll be a fun one as well. So I think I am good to go, and I can pass it over to Josh. I'm just going to stop sharing.
All right, good evening, everybody. I'm going to share my screen now. Nice to have everybody here from all the different locations that you are, far and wide, Canada and the US. So thank you for joining us. There we go. As Nikki said, we will be monitoring the Q&A. So if you have questions, it'd be great if you can keep them in the Q&A rather than trying to monitor the chat and the Q&A as the presentation goes on. It'll just be a little bit easier for me to keep track and respond to questions. I do like things to be interactive, so I will be asking you questions and looking for some feedback there and your input in terms of what you're familiar with. but it'd be easiest if questions do get posted to the Q&A, and there'll be certain points throughout the presentation where you'll be able to post your questions. And as Nikki said, we won't be able to get to all of them, but perhaps 3 or 4 for each question period, so that you don't have to wait until the very end to get there. A little bit of information about myself and background. I'm a professor at Fleming College, and I teach in the ecosystem management program and the conservation biology program at the college primarily. Since I was 8 years old, I've had a fascination with snakes, which then blossomed into fascination with all amphibians and reptiles. And I guess that's where I've spent most of my time at work, at play, and in my academic life as well, essentially studying and working with these animals. So for me, I'm one of those people that there really isn't a line between work and play. I essentially do the same thing when I'm playing and working, and that is trying to learn more about these animals, either by reading or getting out there and doing research and volunteering with different organizations. And I've certainly worked with these animals a lot in Ontario, and the objective this evening, it is sort of an Ontario focus because we are talking about the Oak Ridges Moraine, but we'll also be talking about amphibian and reptile biology and ecology in general as well. So there'll be lots of opportunity to learn about these fascinating creatures, which unfortunately are not appreciated by everybody. But with the number of people that we've got here this evening, I guess there's definitely lots of interest. And while they may not be your favorite creatures on the planet, hopefully will help to maybe sway you more along the side of being a fan than not a fan by the end of the evening. All right, so start things off. We've got one of the most ubiquitous frog species in Ontario that will be, may have been calling already in some parts of southern Ontario, but certainly will be calling up in central Ontario where I am pretty soon. Does anybody know what species of frog this is? And you can pop this into the Q&A if you've got an answer there. So I'm going to be asking you questions, so you can pop answers or questions in there. So if anybody wants to give me, okay, very good. Renee and Carolyn. All right. And Denise. Yep. Okay. So we have a spring peeper and tree frog are the two most common responses, and the spring peeper is actually in the tree frog family. So I guess you're all right in all those answers, but the most specific answer is a spring peeper. And this species name for this frog is Pseudacris. Pseudacris crucifer. And the way you can remember for identification, I'm hoping this evening to teach you a little bit about identification as well as the biology. So Pseudacris crucifer and crucifer or crucifix, we can see typically there's a X on the back of this frog. And it's a tiny frog. It's about the size of your fingernail. It's one of the smallest species in the province. But Pseudacris crucifer with the X on its back. Very good. Okay, now we're going to have a little quiz here to start things off. When we look at animals with a backbone, so vertebrates, we have a variety of different vertebrate groups, and I want to sort of get a sense of what your thoughts are in terms of the diversity of the species within each of these groups. So when I say diversity, I'm sort of thinking about the species richness. So how many species in each of these groups are there? And maybe what we want to do, first of all, not guess the number of species, but which group do you think has the most number of species? So we have birds, and we have reptiles, we have amphibians, and we have mammals. So again, maybe we can get a few people to weigh in the Q&A, and then we'll see who has the best guess at diversity there. So go ahead and again, you can type in the Q&A. So Olivia says birds. All right. And Britt says birds. Cynthia birds. Heather Cooper says birds. All right. We've got someone saying reptiles. That's Renee. All right, good work. And Amphibians, we got one for amphibians. Birds seem to be getting the most. Someone's going for the mammals there, so they don't feel left out. Good work. All right, looks like birds is the most popular response, followed by looks like reptiles and amphibians were second. So this is what folks are saying is number one, and then looks like kind of a tie for second in here, and the mammals have the fewest votes at this point in time. So good work. Are you ready for the big reveal? Here we go. Surprise, surprise for lots of folks there, I think. There wasn't long ago that there were more bird species than reptile species. How is it that these numbers are changing? You know, as I said, not too long ago, a couple of years ago, and even a year and a half ago, you would have had more species of bird than reptiles. What's happened? Any ideas? Have they evolved that quickly? Not so much. More species being discovered. It's not so much a decline. It's a good note there, Olivia, in terms of extinction. Birds are decreasing from Renee. It's not so much that. The birds are staying about the same. But what's happened is that these birds have been studied for a long time. And so the discovery of new species is not as frequent as it is with reptiles, which have not been studied as intensively. And Toby mentioned something really important here, new info regarding genetics, and that's something that we're learning more, and that's DNA is now revealing something interesting for us, and they're revealing these species called cryptic species that are hiding. Think of cryptic meaning things that are hiding. And so what we thought was one species is actually multiple species. And so with DNA, it's revealing that these species are actually multiple species. And so that's increasing the number of species in some of these groups that haven't been studied. There are actually some studies indicating that maybe even with birds, that as they go through and look at the genetics of birds, that the number of species may increase as much as 2 times the number of species that they are right now. But I'm going to throw another wrench in things. I'm not going to get into it in great detail, but you know that birds are reptiles. So actually, there are on the planet, there are right now 21,000 species of reptiles. And one of those groups is what we call the birds, and the rest of them are what you would traditionally call reptiles: snakes, lizards, turtles, crocodilians, and the tuataras. All right, so we're going to focus on the traditional group that we call reptiles. We're not going to get a whole lot into birds this evening. But if you want to learn more about that relationship, birds, of course, are our living dinosaurs. All right, so those are our global numbers. Now let's just play the game again with Ontario and look at frogs and toads. And then we can look at our turtles. And we can look at our snakes and lizards here. And we can look at the salamanders over here. So let's see again. Let's weigh in on which group do you think has the greatest number of species in the province of Ontario. We've got snakes and lizards from Toby. All right. Snakes and lizards from Renee. Okay. Anybody else? Salamanders from Mike. Snakes and lizards, Krishna. Frogs, SNL. Then I don't mean not Saturday Night Live. Yeah, good. All right. So we have turtles. All right, getting abroad, but seems like snakes and lizards are getting the majority of responses there. Again, some for the turtles and frogs. Good. All right, so we'll stop the polling there and do the big reveal and see where we're at. Here we go. So again, our group was correct. 15 species of snakes and 1 species of lizard gives us 16 in that group, followed by the frogs, which is one of the other ones that was very common as far as the group goes, and then salamanders. So, for the most part, our numbers seem to indicate the proper sequence in terms of diversity there. And so what I want to do this evening is cover off some information about some of those species. We're not going to get to all of them. We don't have that much time, but I want to give you some information about each of these taxonomic groups and some of the species we have in Ontario. And they're all quite interesting in a variety of ways, but I'm trying to create some connections for these species as well for you in terms of their ecology. So hopefully teach you some things or maybe reinforce some things you already know about them as we go through. So let's see, actually, let's see if we can identify these species that are here. We're going to go through some ID characteristics in a moment, but just to get an idea, imagine there's some people that would be able to identify. So starting at the left-hand side with our frog, you can see enough of it to identify this species and see the key ID feature for it. So Cynthia says green frog. That's one possibility. Anybody have any other possibilities? There are two frogs in Ontario, so bullfrog and the green frog. Thanks, Janet. And we got leopard, American bullfrog. So yes, the two species that are most frequently confused for each other that have this appearance are the American bullfrog and the green frog. And the key ID feature you're going to look at, and an important feature to look at for frogs in particular, especially in this group that is the genus Lithobates, or these sort of true frogs, is this ridge of skin. It's called a dorsolateral fold. So dorso, meaning the top, lateral, meaning to the side. So it's a fold of skin that is along the top and at the side of the body. And this fold of skin in a bullfrog goes just around the eardrum. In a green frog, it goes around the eardrum and down the body. And so in this frog, we can see it just goes around the eardrum. So this is indeed an American bullfrog. All right, good job there. Now, does anybody know the turtle species to the right of the bullfrog? Cynthia said mud or musk turtle. Toby says mud or musk turtle. All right, well done. And we'll talk about some ID features, but when we're looking at turtle ID features, we want to look at the carapace. That's what we call that top part of the shell. And the mud or musk turtle has a very high domed carapace. It's got smooth margins along the side. There aren't any ridges anywhere on the carapace. And these light lines on the face, especially on young individuals like this one, are quite prominent on a musk turtle. A good job there as well. Okay, and our only lizard in the province of Ontario, the five-line skink. This is a species that I actually completed my PhD thesis studying these lizards on the Canadian Shield and looking at their habitat, movement patterns, and spatial ecology, as well as their morphology in terms of their body size and shape. So that's the five-line skink. Excellent. So we've got that one. And it is a species at risk in Ontario, and so is the musk turtle. These are both species that are considered species at risk in the province. The five-line skink is considered a special concern in the Southern Shield region, and it's considered to be endangered in the Carolinian zone. All right, now this last one's a little bit tougher. I'm not sure if anybody will get that one, but what's our salamander species? Anybody have any idea? Whoa, Toby, you know your stuff. All right, well done. Toby says four-toed. Janet says Jefferson's. So we'll actually don't get into the idea of a Jefferson's, but compared to a Jefferson's, this salamander Jefferson's would be a slate gray to a black color, and uniformly colored that way, with maybe some blue spots along the side. But it is indeed a four-toed salamander. That's what Toby has indicated. It is a four-toed salamander. And we can identify the four-toed. First of all, the underside is quite white and sort of a pure white in color. We'll see an image that gives us a little bit more detail there. The nose is often a light color, but the rest of the body is a little bit darker. Again, this is a really tough one. So well done to identify that, Toby, and some good suggestions from Heather and Renee and Cynthia as well. All right. It is in the same family as the dusky salamander, which is what Cynthia recommended there, but not the same species. Good job. All right, so let's talk a little bit about some of the ID features we're going to be talking about as we go through this evening. The first ID feature that we look at is just general color and pattern. So in the upper left here, looking at whether there are sort of uniform spots on the animal, like in this particular frog here, with the northern leopard frog has these uniform spots along the body and along the side. And so looking at those patterns, looking at the pattern on the legs is also something we look at. For example, whether these bars line up on the legs or not are important features. We also look for the sort of texture of the skin. Of course, in the center here, we have a toad. This is a toad from Ontario that is actually a listed species, the Fowler's toad. And so we look for these things called tubercles. That's, we know that we like to call them warts, bumps, lumps, but the proper term is tubercles. So toads have tubercles on their skin. We look at that. It's hard to see on this individual, but toads also have this enlarged parotoid gland that secretes poison behind their eye. And so that's another characteristic of toads that we look at, comparing them to other species of frog. And here down here, now remember what I said about the bullfrog, and I talked about this dorsolateral fold. So we can see it goes around the eardrum, but it also continues down the side. So this is our green frog down here. But looking at that dorsolateral fold and the extent of it is important. The other thing that we look at down here is the color of the inside of the thigh. So this is a key ID feature in a lot of different frog species, looking at the inside of the thigh. And the presence of toe pads and the size of those toe pads and the condition of the feet. These are all important ID features for frogs. I had a quick question from Janet here regarding the Fowler's toads. Are they always that light? They generally are lighter in color than an American toad, but toads and frogs in general, their color does change depending on their temperature quite often. When they're cool, they tend to be darker in color, or when they're not particularly happy, they tend to be a little bit darker in color, so when they're stressed. But Fowler's toads on average and typically are a little bit lighter than an American toad, but it's not a reliable ID feature. One of the things you're going to look at for IDing a Fowler's toad compared to an American toad, first of all, is where you are in the province of Ontario. If you're not in southern Ontario along the shores of Lake Erie, you're not looking at a Fowler's toad because that's where their distribution is limited to in the province. The other thing you're going to look at is the underside of the toad. The Fowler's toads have a white underside, sometimes with 1 or 2 black spots, whereas the American toad has more spots in a regular pattern. All right. So I'll answer one more question here from looks like Kushagra. You mentioned what is the largest toad? You mean the largest toad in the province of Ontario would be the American toad. The largest toad in the world would be the marine toad or cane toad. Cane toad can get to be big enough that it would, not quite fill up a dinner plate from side to side, but certainly from tip of its nose to the back of its body, it would be pretty much as long as a dinner plate is wide for a really big cane toad. Okay, so those are frog ID features. We're looking at salamander ID. Here's a four-toed salamander upside down over here on the left, so we can see the color of the underside. So that's something that you're going to use to identify salamanders if you come across them, is looking at the color of the underside of the body. We also look at the tails of salamanders. This salamander here has a very narrow tail. It means that it's a species that spends time in and around the water. And so that narrow tail versus a round tail, and also the length of the tail relative to the body. Some salamanders have tails that are usually longer than the body. Other ones have tails that might be more closer to the length of the body. And just as with the frogs and all other species, we're going to look at the pattern. So in this case, this blue spotted salamander has blue spots all over its body. And the distribution of those blue spots is going to help us to identify it as well. So, the color and pattern is important. Salamanders have these little, they look almost like wrinkles on the side of the body. And if you are looking at field guides and trying to identify them, these are called costal grooves because this is the side of the body. And so it's referred to as the costal region. And these costal grooves and the number of costal grooves are important ID features for salamanders outside of Ontario. In Ontario, you might look and see if they are present or absent. Like on this species, they're present. And over here on the species that we're looking at the tail, we can see that they're absent. And so those are some ID features. And then we have one species in Ontario that retains its gills, this one here in the center. It retains its gills even as an adult. Does anybody know what species that is, that retains its gills and is aquatic as an adult? It doesn't ever come out of the water. Janet says, and Cynthia, mud puppy, exactly. So that's a mud puppy. It's not a puppy, and actually don't really live in the mud either, but that is our salamander that keeps its larval characteristic of the gills throughout its life. All right, very good. So those are salamander ID features, frog ID features. Now let's talk a little bit about some of the characteristics of these animals that we're going to be discussing. On the left and the right, the first thing when we look at amphibians and reptiles, most people don't associate parental care with reptiles. But as we've been doing more and more research about these animals, we realize that there's actually a fair bit of parental care. And one of the most common forms of parental care with reptiles and amphibians is actually creating some sort of a nest or an area for the young or the eggs, and then remaining with them. Does anybody know what species we have here on the left? What salamander species? It's all you got to kind of do is describe what you're looking at there. Janet says redback salamander. That is correct. And Julianne says redback as well. Yep, very good. Eastern redback, Toby, very good. So yes, redback salamander. Though I'm not sure how many of you knew that this salamander is a species that looks after its eggs. So maybe you're surprised actually to find that this salamander lays eggs on land. Right? Most of us think of the typical life cycle of an amphibian, that they lay eggs in the water. Those eggs hatch into larvae, and then those larvae live in the water for a while, and then they come out onto land as adults. And that's true for most amphibians in Ontario, but certainly not true for all amphibians around the world. And this is a species we have right here in Ontario that has something called direct development. And that means exactly what it sounds like, in that the little salamanders develop fully in development. Sorry, talking and printing at the same time is not my specialty. So the salamanders develop fully into little tiny salamanders in the egg, and they hatch out and they live on land right away. So that's a pretty unique thing. And the salamanders, the adult females, will actually stay with the eggs while they're developing as well. I'll get to your question in a second, Alex. And over here, we have our five-line skink. And this is another species that makes a nest and stays with those eggs as well. So parental care is something that is more common in reptiles and amphibians than we think. It's certainly different. Reptiles and amphibians don't all feed their young, but there are even cases of amphibians that feed their young. There are these legless amphibians called caecilians, for example. And the legless caecilians, the females in some species will feed their young skin. So what happens is when the young are born, the female produces this really high fat content, nutritious skin that the young feed off of, and then she'll produce it again, and maybe 2 or 3 times after they're born, to actually feed them when they are first born and developing. So some pretty interesting things that happen there. Alex asked, where do they typically lay their eggs? On land, typically under logs and rocks in moist environments and in the soil, where they're going to be protected from drying out. But the most common places you find redback salamanders are under logs and rocks in deciduous forest or mixed forest ecosystems, of which there are plenty along the Oak Ridges Moraine. This is one of the most abundant amphibian species in eastern North America. So yeah, that's where they would lay those eggs. Okay. Any questions there? Why are redback salamanders a good indicator species, from Julianne? And what time do the redbacks lay eggs, and when do they hatch? Okay, so I'll answer these 2 questions before we move on to the next slide. And the last one we'll answer from Pam there. So I've got 3 questions on the queue. First question from Julianne: why are redback salamanders a good indicator species? Well, the reason that they're used as an indicator species is because they represent a lot of biomass, and biomass is essentially the weight of living organisms in an ecosystem. So if we look at the weight of salamanders in a deciduous forest, they represent more biomass than all the breeding birds at peak breeding season. So they represent energy available in the ecosystem. Okay, and so they're an important indicator. If we don't have a lot of redbacks in a place where we expect to see them, then there's a potential issue with the productivity and nutrient cycling in that ecosystem. The other reason, of course, is amphibians, because of their permeable skin. Amphibians in general are considered good indicators because they are sensitive to environmental pollutants. But redbacks in particular, it's because of their biomass. And if we find in a forest ecosystem where we expect there to be a lot of redbacks and there aren't, that could be an indication of issues with the productivity and nutrient cycling in that ecosystem. Toby's question: what time of year do the redbacks lay eggs and when do they hatch? The eggs typically are laid sometime in May or early June. It depends on how early they get active. So if we have an early spring, then the eggs are going to be laid earlier. They typically hatch out in late July or August. Depends again on what kind of a season we've had and how warm it is. And the last question before I move on to the next slide, as I said, we're not going to get to everybody, but Pam asked about, is sex determined by temperature, as in some reptiles? That's a good question, Pam. As far as the five-line skink goes, no, they have genotypic determined sex, so it's based on the chromosomes. But there are lizards, plenty of them, that have their temperature or their sex that's determined by temperature. And there's all kinds of different patterns where within a few degrees, you'll either get all males or all females being produced from that incubation at a certain temperature. But five-line skinks do not exhibit that. And in Ontario, the reptiles that do have temperature-dependent sex determination are the turtles. There are no cases of it that we're aware of in amphibians. All right, so those are the answers to those questions that we can get to. All right. As far as pets go, sorry, I'm going to answer that one. We shouldn't be taking anything from the wild to keep as a pet in captivity. So no, the answer is no, don't keep them as pets. If you are going to have a pet reptile or amphibian, then it should be from an animal that was born and raised in captivity and from a source that is reputable and that looks after them. And you should also make sure that it's a species that you can properly look after. Okay. All right. So now we're going to move on. So as I said, we're going to go through different groups of animals and try and establish some connections here. So we have 6 snakes. So that's obviously a connection. That's not what I'm looking for, is that fact that they're all snakes. We also notice that for their identification, when looking at identification of snakes, one of the things that we look at is the type of scales that they have. And if you look at all of these snakes, except for the one here because it's wet, it looks very shiny. The rest of these snakes have more of a dull appearance throughout most of their body. And that's because they have scales that are referred to as keeled scales. So the scale, if you look at the scale of a keeled scaled snake, if we draw a diagram here, it's got a ridge that runs down the center and it makes it look a little bit bumpy. It's not as smooth, so they tend not to be as shiny. So all of these snakes have keeled scales. They are all snakes, but I'm going to we're going to work through our species here, and I'll tell you a little bit about their ecology. And after I've done that, we'll see if you can tell me what the connection is. We won't worry about it for now, but I want you to listen for any common thread that runs through the discussion of all 6 of these snakes. So let's see if we can identify them first. In the top left-hand corner, we have one of our smallest snake species in the province. Does anybody have an idea of what species this snake is? DK's brown or northern brown snake. That is correct. All right, very good. And key ID features for this species, the spots along the back here, which are sort of on the border of this lighter stripe that runs down the center of the body. That's an important ID feature, as well as his teardrop-shaped spots under the eye. Now, this species of snake is a snake that is, as I said, one of the smallest species of snake in the province. The brown snake and the red belly are very small. And this snake, in terms of its reproduction, it gives birth to live young, typically in late July or August. And it likes to feed on slugs and snails. So if you find this snake in your garden, that is a good thing. It's helping to control the slug and snail population in your garden. In the center, of course, we've got a snake in the water. That's a northern water snake. And this species is a snake that kind of gets a bad reputation because sometimes when people are swimming around in the water, the snake comes over to investigate. And that's because they're curious. Or it could be if you're sitting really still, they're thinking that you're just something like a log or a rock that they might come over and rest on. But these snakes are often described as aggressive. And I try not to use the term aggressive because typically what's happening is that we are making the animal feel threatened. And so the proper term for what snakes and reptiles do when people come around is that they become defensive. And one of the ways they become defensive is by displaying behavior that might seem aggressive to get you to leave them alone. Okay, but really they're being defensive because they're feeling threatened. And so if you want to get out there and see these animals, but you're nervous and you're worried about them, as long as you make them feel like you're not a threat, they will leave you alone. If you run around and pick them up, then they might do what was expected, and that's they'll do what they have to do to protect themselves. And northern water snakes, if you do pick them up, will sometimes bite to defend themselves, but they're not a venomous species. We only have one venomous species in Ontario, and that's the eastern Massasauga. Over here, we have our red-bellied snake. And the red-bellied snake is another small species, as I said, with the brown snake. As far as identification features go, we look at the stripes along the side of that light band. Instead of having spots, they've got a stripe, and they have a light spot on the top of their head. And notice that the dark teardrop shape markings are not present under the eye. So that's a key ID feature there. And this snake here is a gravid female. So we use this term gravid to describe snakes that are expecting. And she is going to be giving birth to live young. This photograph was taken in May. And like the northern brown snake, and actually like the northern water snake, will be giving birth sometime in late July or early August, depending on temperatures. Now, how many people knew that we have two different species of garter snake in Ontario? And if you know what species those are. One is a species that's not listed at all, and the other species is an endangered species. So see if anybody knows what the endangered species of garter snake is in Ontario. Red-sided garter is a good guess, Renee. Pam mentioned eastern. Cynthia mentioned ribbon. Janet says butlers. Okay, you got it, Janet. It is correct. It is the butlers. The ribbon snake is listed as a species of special concern, but it's not endangered. And so we have all three of those species along the bottom. Can you tell me which species is which in the bottom? So if we start in the bottom left, for example, any idea on there what species we have? It's either eastern, ribbon, or butler's garter snake. Let's see if we can ID that. Eastern, all right. That's the most common guess for the one on the left. Sorry, did I say the one on the left or did I say the one on the right? I think I said left, right? Correct, I mean. All right, so the far left actually is a butler's. So the butler's is actually here on the far left. And one of the things you're going to look at for butler's garter snake, at least you can tell in this image here, is the head is not much bigger than the neck. They've got kind of a small head. So you look at what looks like a eastern garter snake with a head that looks a little bit too small is a butler's. If you look at this one here, you can see the cheeks of the head is kind of wider than the neck. So on the far right-hand side, we have the eastern. So this is the eastern garter snake here, which is not listed at all. And then we have the butler's over here, which is an endangered species in the province. It only occurs in southwestern Ontario. In order to identify them, we do look at where the the stripes are on the side. This snake in the center then leaves us with the ribbon snake, and the key feature here is that they've got a dark snout, all right, which then makes this little light patch in front of the eye more prominent. And again, the stripe on the side on this species starts on the 3rd row of scales. So that's an important thing. So David mentioned that the northern ribbon or the eastern ribbon, but the ribbon has that little light patch in front of the eye. Very good. Okay, good job. So and again, with these snakes, the garter snakes, have you ever seen a little garter snake in the fall? Anybody seen those little snakes? They're quite tiny, and a eastern garter snake may have as many as 30 to 40 young at a time, and they give birth to their young alive. So there's a couple of questions. So we'll get to those, and then we'll see if you can tell me what the connection is between all 6 of these species. So Alex says, are all of these snakes picked up the same way? I find them in buildings that they need to be taken out of often. Yes, when you pick up a snake, first of all, I'm not sure how you pick them up, but you should not grab them behind the head. They've got a very delicate connection between their neck and their vertebrae and their skull, and most people squeeze too hard and they injure them. So if you're not comfortable picking it up, then use something like a bucket and a broom and get it into the bucket and then just get it outside. If you're comfortable picking them up, then you should pick them up by grasping them about 1/3 of the way down the body, and then letting them crawl through your hands. So just try to support their body. They'll squirm a little bit at first, but if you support their body and don't dangle them, you'll be okay. Do not grab them by the neck and do not grab them by the tail. Okay, so that would be how you'd handle them if you have to. Jason asks, how can you tell if a snake is gravid, or what told you the top right was gravid? That takes some practice, but looking at the body of the snake, and she's nice and thick throughout her entire body, not just where the stomach is, it indicates that she's got some young developing inside of her body. And so looking at the thickness of the body of the snake will help me to identify whether she is gravid or not. Okay, so that is done there. Kushagra, what is the tiny, again, you asked, so I'm not sure whether you mean the tiniest snake in the province or elsewhere, but the smallest snake in the province is the red-bellied snake, followed by the brown snake. So in Ontario, this is the smallest snake, followed by this one over here on the top left in terms of their size. The last question from Joanne, do snakes look after their young? There aren't cases of snakes looking after their young, but there are cases of snakes that do look after their eggs, but we don't know of cases of snakes looking after their young. However, when a lot of these snakes give birth, the young will remain in an area around where the parents are, or the mother is, until they shed their skin at first. And once they've shed their skin, then they head out and look after themselves. Okay, so connection. As I discussed, what is something that I mentioned about all 6 of these species that was the same? So we're looking at something that I mentioned about them as we went through. So let's see. Live birth and keeled scales. Yeah, they give birth to live young, something that a lot of people aren't aware of with respect to snakes. And so I'd like to show you just a short video about snakes, and we can see a rattlesnake giving birth to its young, if we're okay for that. I'm just going to share that video with you. And here we go. And I'll start to play, and if you can just confirm in the Q&A there that you can and here.
After about 7 months of breeding, gestating, and then sitting on her eggs, Diega is incredibly hungry. So we have to be extremely cautious when we're working with her. Here we are inside Diega's domain. You'll have to excuse me because I'm going to be looking over my shoulder quite a bit here. When you got a 20-foot long ravenous snake that wouldn't hesitate to nail you, you're going to be checking over your shoulder. Diega is a reticulated python. This is one of 2 species of snake that has actually been documented to have eaten a human being. All pythons are animals that lay eggs, and this snake in particular laid 77 eggs this year. As far as egg laying goes, it's something that most people expect of reptiles, but something they don't expect is live birth. Rattlesnakes, such as our eastern diamondback rattlesnakes, actually give birth to live young. The little rattlesnakes are formed from eggs just like the pythons. Those eggs develop fully into tiny little baby rattlesnakes, and she gives birth to them live. And they're ready to go and take care of themselves from the moment they're born. The same is true of the reticulated pythons. However, of course, they're going to incubate in eggs outside of the female's body. And she's actually going to stay coiled around those eggs for the duration of the time that they need to incubate, which could be as much as 60 to 90 days. At birth, these snakes are already anywhere from 60 to 70 centimeters in length. That's anywhere from 2 to 2.5 feet long. Pretty long snake. So essentially from December right through until late July, this snake didn't eat a thing, which used up most of her body fat. Now she wants it back. And she wants it back from any source she can get it from.
There we go. So that's from one of my past lives in terms of things that I did. I managed a reptile zoo for 10 years, and we had the opportunity to document those eggs being laid and those rattlesnakes being born. So just before I move on, there's a couple of questions. The venomous snake in Ontario is called the Eastern Massasauga, and it's a type of rattlesnake. There is no pattern that you can rely on to identify venomous versus non-venomous snakes. There is no one single method to identify a venomous snake versus non-venomous. But I can tell you there's a really easy method to staying safe. Give snakes their space. Venomous or not, there aren't any snakes out there that are going to be coming after you. So if you happen to come across a snake, if you give it its space and leave it alone, give it a way to continue on its own direction and path, you have nothing to worry about. All right, so that's the most important thing to keep in mind when you're worried about snakes. But if you're traveling in an area where there are venomous snakes, you need to learn how to identify those snakes in that area, but there's no way to tell just by the pattern that that the animal is venomous or not. There's a question from Joanne about why she doesn't eat. Well, if you look at the snakes, these ones, these live bears, their entire body becomes essentially full of developing snakes, you know, from the bottom of their body, just where their tail starts, all the way up pretty much to where their heart is filled with these developing snakes, and they can't pass waste through their body, and they can't digest. So after a certain period, they don't eat until they've given birth. And so they have to build up their fat reserves and then reproduce and then build up their fat reserves. So a lot of them don't breed every single year. As far as there's a good question there about, you know, how do we term this? This is in terms of ovoviviparous. This is a term. Ovoviviparous. And that is a form of reproduction where the eggs are developed inside the body and the young are born live. But these snakes here are actually viviparous. They do have a connection with the mother. So there is a sort of a placental connection. The placenta isn't as well developed as it is in a mammal, so there's not a lot of nutrition exchange or anything that happens there. But these would be considered viviparous. I didn't even get that right here. Again, trying to talk and spell at the same time. Viviparous. All right. And so those are the live bears. Good questions there. Okay. Let's keep moving through here. So reproduction and live birth was the theme for these 6 species. Here's another 4 species that we're looking at here. And let's work on some identification and talk a little about the biology and ecology of these species. We have on the top left-hand corner a frog we saw already, That's the northern leopard frog. And identification features for this species, it does have these spots on the body, and they're pretty, uniform, or what we might refer to as sort of regular spots. If you were to describe this frog, you'd describe it as a spotted frog. And there are two species of spotted frogs in Ontario. One is the leopard frog, and one is a pickerel frog. The pickerel frog, if this were a pickerel frog, you would be able to see orange on the inside of the thigh here in the picture, but this one doesn't have an orange color on the inside of the thigh, making it a leopard frog. And leopard frogs are one of the most abundant frogs we have in the province, and they're found in a wide variety of environments. Kind of an interesting thing about them, though, if you're wandering around, I don't know if anybody's been out in a moist meadow far away from a pond and come across a leopard frog, but they spend their winter in a pond, and then as the season progresses, they often will move quite a ways away from the pond, spending their time in wet meadows, and then going back to the pond to overwinter. So this species, although it relies on those ponds at wintertime and will often be around them, during the summer, you'll find them in those wet, moist meadow ecosystems. Over here on the top right, this is an interesting animal for its life cycle. We talked about, the typical life cycle where an amphibian will lay eggs in the water, which hatch into larvae or tadpoles, and then those larvae and tadpoles transform and come onto land, where they live as an adult on land or in the water. This species starts, first of all, by laying eggs in the water, but the female will, if there's a plant, she'll actually take her eggs and she'll curl them up underneath the leaf of a plant. And so again, think of parental care. The female of this species will wrap the leaf of a plant around an egg, and then she'll go up to another leaf, and then she'll wrap a leaf around that egg. So, she deposits her eggs one at a time on the vegetation in the water. And then those eggs hatch out into larvae, but then those larvae transform and they come out onto land. And when they're on land, they're referred to as an eft. And some of you may have heard of efts before. So they wander around on land for anywhere from 2 to 6 years before they then head back to the water. This individual here is about to head back to the water. When they're efts, they're very bright orange in color. But as they get older and get ready to head back to the water, their back becomes a little darker. Their belly remains very bright because they are toxic. If you were to eat one of these, and when animals eat them, it makes them feel unsettled, and quite often they'll throw up, which then will make the animal avoid eating the brightly colored animal or the brightly colored salamander. But we notice here, I talked about the tail. The tail is long and slender here. It's very thin. And so this is the adaptation to getting ready to go back to the aquatic life as an adult. So they start in the water, then they head on to land, and they wander about exploring the terrestrial environment, and then they head back to the water as adults. But this species, when they are in the water, they still have to breathe air because they have lost their gills. When they make this transition here, they lose their gills, and they can't grow them back again. So that's this species. And that's the eastern newt, or the spotted newt. Okay. Is there a function that the tail is heavier in aquatic environment? Well, the tail isn't so much that it's heavy, Heather. It's that it's broader, right? It's like a paddle, and so it's better to have that as far as for swimming. So it's flat, but vertically it's broad, so that it's easier for them to swim. Okay. Toby, adult newts are able to go back to an F stage if a wetland dries up and move. Well, they wouldn't be at the F stage. They don't change, and they don't look like an F anymore, but certainly if a wetland dries up, they will wander on land until they find another wetland, absolutely. But it wouldn't refer to it as going back to being an F, because they don't change their appearance. They still will look the same as an adult newt in terms of their color and pattern and proportions, but they'll just migrate to another wetland. Good question there. Joanne, does the diet change when they go from land to water? Absolutely. When they're in the water as adults, they're going to be feeding on aquatic invertebrates, or aquatic animals without a backbone. And on land, of course, they're feeding on terrestrial vertebrates. But all amphibians, interesting to note, it's important to note that all amphibians, once they transform to the adult stage, all amphibians are carnivorous. There are no omnivorous or vegetarian amphibians that we're aware of as adults. But as tadpoles, there are certainly tadpoles that eat them. So we have our northern leopard frog, the eastern newt. Down here on the bottom left is a curious snake that has some interesting behavior. Anybody have any idea what kind of snake that is? Okay, Janet says eastern hognose. That's correct. Good work. It is an eastern. Britt, there is a western species, but this is an eastern that occurs in Ontario. The western occurs in Manitoba, but not quite into Ontario. So that's good. That's all right, Britt. It's good to get those answers out there and give it a shot. As far as ID features for this species, it's not too tough if you're looking at them in person, because they have a pretty stout, big, thick head and a thick body. And of course, if you look at their nose, they do have a pointed upturned nose, which is quite unique. And they also have some pretty interesting behavior as well. And so I'd like to show you another video of a hognose snake giving us some lessons in acting. So let's have a look at that. This is a snake that I came across while doing some of my research. Come across them somewhat regularly, but here we go. I know some of you weren't able to hear last time. I would check your audio right now. I'm just going to go back, but I have set my sharing to allow the sound to be shared. So it's working, and some of you had it, but if it's not, just check your audio on your end and see that it's connected properly, and go from there. So here's our little video about the hognose snake. All right, I'm gonna make sure all the credits come up there for you. Oh, there's some questions about the hognose. So that is a behavior that the snake has when they feel threatened. They will often try to make themselves look as threatening as possible by flaring out their neck and hissing, and they'll even strike, but they strike with their mouths closed. And then if that doesn't work, then they will play dead. And if you walk away and sort of stay out of sight, then you can watch them magically come back to life. But they're playing dead for a hognose. They lay upside down, they stick out their tongue, and they release this foul-smelling fluid called musk that makes them very unappealing, and that protects them because a lot of animals will avoid something that's behaving in such a strange way or that might look sick, and so they lose interest. So that's the eastern hognose snake. Now these snakes, oh, they are sort of short and stout. One of the things that we know about hognose snakes, they will travel really large distances. You know, we know of individuals overnight traveling anywhere from 1 kilometer to 2 kilometers overnight, which is pretty impressive for a snake that's about, you know, maybe twice the size of your average desktop ruler that you'd have in school, for example, if you want to get an idea of the size of it. So not really big, but imagine being that size and moving 2 kilometers overnight. So that's our eastern hognose snake. There's a couple of questions there that came up in terms of hognose. It's not imitating a rattlesnake. There are some species of snake that will shake their tails that makes a noise, but those snakes are not mimicking a rattlesnake either. What they're doing is making a noise to let you know where they are and to hopefully get you to leave them alone. So it's not really an imitation. In this case, the snake does flare out its neck, and people will often say that it's imitating a cobra. But again, you can't imitate something that doesn't exist where you are. And hognose snakes don't read books, so they don't know anything about cobras. There's only so many ways you can make yourself look big and scary as a snake. And one of the ways you can do that is by flattening out your neck. So it just so happens that cobras and hognose snakes do the same thing to look threatening, but one isn't mimicking the other. Okay. There was another question about, you know, how do you tell if a snake is sleeping or not? That's really difficult to tell if a snake is sleeping because they don't have eyelids, so they don't close their eyes. But really the only way to tell if a snake is sleeping is if you happen to move around the snake and its eyes, you know, don't follow you and it doesn't respond, then it may be asleep. But generally they're pretty wary in the wild. And so to come across a sleeping snake that doesn't wake up as you approach is not that common. All right, last thing there, David asks about something called a Dovernoise gland, which is essentially a gland that produces specialized compounds that can have effect of venom. So this snake is technically considered to be rear fanged. It does have large teeth in the back of its jaw, and it does have a Dovernoise gland, but it's certainly not a snake that is a threat to human beings. And the purpose of the venom in this case, there's not really documented cases of the venom actually immobilizing the prey. So there's some people that say, yes, it's considered a venomous species, and other people who say that the hognose snake is not venomous. But it does have, you know, glands to produce this specialized saliva that's very much like venom. But yeah, there's still a debate about whether we consider them venomous or not, David. Okay, our last species here. Does anybody know what species of turtle this is? This is a threatened species. Yes, Janet, she's very quick on that one. Waiting for you, like you were just waiting for me to say that. Emma as well. Blanding's turtle, right? And we can tell that it's a Blanding's turtle by looking at that bright yellow throat. It's the only turtle in Ontario that has that very, very bright yellow throat. So Janet, thanks for waiting. You were right there. You buzzed in fastest. So I guess if we were on a game show, you would have you'd have got the points for that one. All right. Now, in terms of Blanding's turtles, there's all kinds of very interesting things about them that we can talk about, but this is a species, and someone mentioned, you know, habitat loss and threats related to human activity. And this turtle species, one of the biggest concerns for this turtle species is road mortality, and it's a problem for all kinds of reptiles and amphibians because they do get hit on the road. And the Blanding's turtle does travel long distances to lay its eggs. A female might travel, you know, 1 kilometer to 5 kilometers to find a spot where she's going to lay her eggs, and then she'll travel back to her wetland where she spends most of the rest of her days. So this turtle, if it's traveling that far, especially in southern Ontario, you can't go 1 kilometer without having to cross a road. And when the female turtles get hit on the road, that's a real problem. Now, there are some people that are trying to help with that, like the Ontario Turtle Conservation Centre in Peterborough, and they take turtles from all around the province to help put them back together again. You know, if they end up getting hit by a vehicle, and they get these animals back together and release them back into the wild. And they also hatch and incubate some of the eggs. But a big threat for the Blanding's turtle and the amphibians and reptiles in general is road mortality in southern Ontario, where there's so many roads and so much traffic. All right. So any idea what what the connection is between these four species. What did I say sort of as a theme that sort of went through? Laura said travel distances between habitats. Yes, exactly. They are what we would refer to as, I call them the wanderers. All right, so our leopard frog goes from the wetland to the moist meadow, and our newt travels far and wide in its sort of teenage years, wandering around like someone who just graduated from high school or university and decided to travel in Europe for a little bit. And our hognose snake travels quite a distance over a short time, and then our Blanding's turtle travels quite a bit in terms of its nesting. Very good. So there's a couple of questions here that I'll answer. What distance and why would they not lay the eggs where they live? Joanne, that's a good question. So the distance away is, if we think about genetics, for example, and inbreeding, little turtles don't travel very far. So one of the ways that some turtle species, and not all turtle species, but one of the things that they believe to be true for the Blandings is one of the reasons it lays its eggs a long way away from its normal habitat that it lives in for the rest of the year, is that those eggs will hatch and those little baby turtles will go into a different wetland. And so then they will intermix genetically with other populations rather than with their own. So that's one of the theories, Joanne, as far as why they travel that distance. And it's another one. Is it true they don't start laying until she's about 10 years old? Actually, that would be really early, Janet. For Blanding's turtles, it might be closer to 16 or 17 years. And in some turtle species, it's not till they're 30 or so. So it takes an awful long time for them to reproduce, which is why they're so vulnerable. Animals that have a very slow maturation rate and a long time between generations, if the adults start getting killed and the adults have an increase in the number of animals that are dying, it becomes a real problem for the population. And so would you put our toads in the wanderer category? Not so much. They do breed in ponds and then they go back into fields, but they don't tend to travel as far as some of our other species. So for example, it might be a few hundred meters, which relative to their size seems like a lot, but not quite as much as these ones, not quite as extreme. All right. The last one, what type of spot does a turtle look for in order to lay its eggs? Don't they usually bury them in the sand? Yes, all turtles lay their eggs on land and they do bury them. So they'll dig a nest and they'll lay the eggs in the soil. So look for soil that's well drained, but is going to remain at a certain humidity. And they also need to make sure that it stays at a right temperature. So typically they're areas that are more open and exposed to the sun, and they tend to be in areas that aren't going to flood, but will remain humid and moist for the duration of the incubation. So some good questions there. Lifespan, Julie, for the Blanding's turtle, we know of individuals that are well over 80 years old, so they think that Blanding's turtles might even reach 100 years in age. And the reason we know of the 80-year-old turtle is a turtle that was tagged and is being tracked, and she's still alive in a long-term project in Michigan. She was tagged in the 1970s, I believe, late 1970s, as an adult already. So she would have already been 15 to 16 years old, maybe 20 when she was initially marked and tagged, and she is still alive today. So some good questions there. Okay, so those are our wanderers. I'm just going to quickly go through these guys to see that we're getting through time and want to be conscious of your time. So we have here some more species that we have in the upper left-hand corner. We have a hatchling of one of the most abundant turtles we have in the province, or at least widespread. Any idea what is up in the top left-hand corner? Snapping turtle is correct. Yes, snapping turtle. Yep. And then in the center, we have our masked frog here. Very early to rise. Wood frog, right, Janet? And then beside that frog, sometimes confused for the spring peeper, which is down on the bottom right with that X on his back. Notice that the markings on the back of this one. This is our smallest frog species. It has these lines instead of an X. So its name, chorus frog, is correct for the top right. Western or boreal. This one is a Western chorus frog. The boreal chorus frog tends to, the lines sometimes are more spotted, but they're hard to tell the difference between them without looking at the genetics. And then in the center, we have a turtle there that that we should be able to identify. For the turtle, yes, painted turtle, exactly right, Renee and Janet again. And then on the bottom left, we've already identified this animal as the mud puppy. So we'll talk a little bit about these animals. First of all, I'll give you an idea of what the connection is by talking about these two species here. So sometimes the wood frog, as I said, is a very, very early animal to become active in breeding. And actually these two frogs as well are very active in breeding early. And I mentioned that the leopard frog overwinters in a pond, and it has to overwinter in a pond that doesn't freeze solid. If the pond freezes solid, that leopard frog is not going to survive. However, these frogs, the chorus frog and the spring peeper and the wood frog, they overwinter in the leaf litter, pretty much at the surface of the ground. So you can imagine surviving the winter just by covering yourself with a few leaves. That's pretty incredible. Now, the turtle is a hatchling painted turtle. And something sometimes happens with the hatching painted turtles. If they don't get out of their nest in the summer, they have to spend the entire winter in the nest. Now, if you're going to cover yourself with leaves or bury yourself in leaves over winter, or you're going to be in a nest as a turtle that's only, 8 or 10 centimeters below the surface of the ground all winter, what's something that you have to be able to deal with pretty well? And that's true for the snapping turtle as well. Antifreeze, Cynthia, very good. So there are these animals can actually produce antifreeze. So they produce compounds in their body, glycerol, that prevents their fluids from freezing. So these species can tolerate being in freezing conditions for several days without actually dying. Whereas most animals, if you're in freezing temperatures, your cells are going to explode, rupture, and die, and that's going to cause you to die as well. But these animals can produce this antifreeze that helps them to stay alive even in temperatures that are below freezing. Now, they're not frozen all winter, but they are exposed to these temperatures for a few days at a time in the conditions that they're in, and they can tolerate that. So that's pretty incredible. And we're trying to study this because if we can do the same thing with living tissue in for humans, we could, for example, preserve organs, and we wouldn't have as much of an issue with organ transplants and that sort of thing. So those are some of the things with these species. So we recognize these animals as being very cold tolerant species. Okay, I've got one more connection here with these 6 species before we wrap up and finish for the evening. So everybody hopefully is doing okay. Seems to be lots of comments there. Toby, some news confusion about Western and boreal chorus frogs in central Ontario. Do you think we have a mix in the area, or do you think genetics will show we have one or the other? Toby, that's a good question about the chorus frogs. There's a project where they're looking for people to work with chorus frogs to get samples, and they're essentially looking at whether the boreal chorus frog is further south in Ontario. And where I am in Ontario and Lindsay, they think that the chorus frogs that we have are boreal. And then in southwestern Ontario, more to the west of the escarpment, they think are westerns. And genetics will reveal that. And I'm assisting with some of the data collection for that project. And if you are interested, for those of you who are in areas that you know of, if there are chorus frogs in your area, look up Blazing Star Environmental. They're involved in this project, and it's a citizen science project. So look up Blazing Star Environmental as your connection if you're interested in getting involved in a project looking at the boreal chorus frogs. But just again, to try to keep myself on track here, I want to go through, and we have 6 species here. Let's see if we can identify them. I'm going to start at the bottom right this time, just to see if I can throw anybody off the scent trail there. Thanks, Colleen, for the compliment on the presentation. I'm glad you're enjoying it. So bottom right, what species of turtle do we have on the bottom right? Oh, Janet's still the first to type it in there. She's quick with the fingers, and Cynthia and Toby all mentioning that that's a map turtle, and that is correct. And we can identify this turtle as a map turtle because of the lines on the face. They're not just all straight down the neck. All right, there's kind of curved, and certainly if you look at the face here, these look like the lines on a topographic map, or they look like contour lines, which is a key ID feature for this species. Another key ID feature is this sort of white upper lip is another important thing for the map turtle. And this turtle is a turtle that really enjoys eating mollusks, and it's a specialist on feeding on mollusks, which are things like clams, and it has actually benefited from invasive species like the zebra mussel. So populations of map turtles are doing really well because there's lots of zebra mussels. However, there are some concerns over the fact that the zebra mussels are accumulating pollutants that are then getting into, obviously, the tissue and getting into the turtles themselves. So while there's lots of food and we get lots of, increase in population, there could be some consequences based on what they're eating and the toxins that they're getting there. All right, so that's the map turtle feeding on those mollusks. Now over to the left of the map turtle, anybody have an idea of what snake species this is? And again, we've got some, oh, Danielle, okay, someone got in there faster than Janet for good work. The ringneck snake, and we can see that bright ring around the neck there, a unique feature. And this snake also has a bright belly. It's a very small snake, only about half the size of a meter stick for the ringneck. And this snake is not often seen by people because it's very secretive and shy. It spends most of its time underneath rocks and logs where its favorite prey is. And we have already seen its favorite prey, that salamander that looks after its eggs. What salamander was looking after its eggs there? I think, again, we'll probably get that pretty quickly, the redback salamander. And so that's one of the favorite foods of the ringneck snake. They love to eat redback salamanders. And Janet, you mentioned blue racer, and it does look like a racer. It has smooth scales and has that slate gray color, but the blue racer doesn't have that light ring around the neck. And the eyes of a blue racer are larger relative to its head as well. That's another key feature. And of course, this is a very small snake, and you can't tell from the photograph. But if you were to come across one of these snakes, even a large ringneck snake at the size that it is, a blue racer would actually have spots on it, because blue racers are born with spots. They look, pretty close to this snake up here when they're young, and then as they grow, they get that dark blue color. But this snake is quite small and has that color right from the time that it's born. All right, so that's the ringneck snake, loves to eat redback salamanders. All right, now the snake to its left, we've already looked at this one, the ribbon snake. Remember that crescent-shaped or half-moon-shaped light patch in front of the eye and the dark nose, key ID feature there. And this snake specializes, compared to a garter snake, we tend to find the ribbon snakes more associated with wetlands. And garter snakes are found in wetlands, but the ribbon snake is rarely found far from wetlands, whereas the garter snake can be found in a wide variety of habitat types. So this is a little bit more specialized than a garter snake in terms of where it likes to live. And our turtle here on the top left, note it does have yellow on its chin, but it doesn't have a yellow throat. What species do we have up there? And it's an endangered species in the province. And actually all of these species are listed. The map turtle is a species of special concern. Oh, sorry, the ribbon snake is not listed, but the map turtle is a species of special concern. The ribbon snake is a species of special concern, and the spotted turtle is an endangered species in the province. And the spotted turtle is one of our smallest turtle species, and it likes to live in bogs and fens. And it actually becomes active quite early. So in southwestern Ontario, these turtles are already active now and getting out and basking. So they are very early in terms of their activity, but they tend to be associated with these small wetlands. And so one of the things that's made them endangered is the fact that these small wetlands are the ones that often are the first ones to get drained. Well, it's pretty cool that you came across some in where you were there in Wainfleet. We do know of them in there. One thing we want to be careful about when we do know where these species are, the spotted turtle, because it is small and it is very attractive, they are often collected as pets. So there are people out there that if they find out where there's a population of spotted turtles, they'll head out there and they'll take all of the turtles or most of the turtles and then try and sell them as pets. So do be careful when you do know the location of threatened and endangered species, who you share that information with. In terms of the location where those animals might be found. Okay, but the spotted turtle specialize in these small wetlands, which makes them quite vulnerable because those are the wetlands that are disappearing. In southwestern Ontario, more than 80% of the wetlands that were present are now gone. And of course, we know with the Oak Ridges Moraine as well, the importance of water and our, using the soil and the planet as a filtration system, as a system to manage water, especially as temperatures and climate becomes more extreme. Things like the Oak Ridges Moraine, they help to absorb that water like a big sponge and, keep it in the ground and in the earth for a longer time, which protects us from issues such as flooding. All right, and our salamander, we've seen this or part of this image already with our salamander, and that's our four-toed salamander. And this salamander is often associated with wetlands that have sphagnum moss, because this salamander, when it's breeding, it lays its eggs in the moss above the water. And so while it's not quite as terrestrial as the redback with the eggs do hatch out and the larvae fall into the water and then they come back onto land, but still the eggs are laid out of the water and then the larvae drop into the water and then they come back out again. So this one has a little bit of a specialized breeding habitat. And if you do come across them, you can see their tail is very brightly colored. And that's because that tail is also designed to break off as a protective mechanism, very much like a lizard, and then they can grow it back. They are pretty cute, Faith, for sure. So that's the four-toed salamander. And then on the top left, who can tell me what species we have on the top left? Eastern milk snake. Very good from Britt and David. That is correct. And of course, they're called milk snakes because of an old folk tale about these snakes going into barns and that they're in the barns drinking milk from cows. And that is not true. They are in those barns, typically getting food, which is typically rodents. But this snake is also in a group of snakes called a king snakes. And king snakes like to eat other reptiles. So if you're someone who doesn't like snakes and who's nervous around snakes, if you do come across a milk snake, that should be at least be one snake you like, because it will eat other snakes. The most common snakes that it likes to eat are the northern brown and the red belly, but they'll also eat other species of snakes as well. So that is our eastern milk snake up there. And as I said, it enjoys eating other reptiles. So we've gone through all of these different species. We talked a little bit about their identification and what is our theme for these? Yeah, they are specialists. Yeah, they're adorable. I'd agree with that too, Janet. But yeah, these are considered specialists in terms of their habitat or their diet or both. And yes, plenty of them are at risk. The eastern milk snake was actually listed as a species of special concern, and it was downlisted, and so it's not listed anymore. And sometimes people, are concerned about that. But really, once the species is listed, that triggers people to go out and start looking for them and getting more information. And when we started looking for these milk snakes and musk turtles as well, which were once listed as threatened, and now they're considered special concern, is we realized that actually there are more of them around than we thought, which is a good thing. And so then they get downlisted, and that was the case with the milk snake. So now it's not a species of special concern anymore. In this case here, Janet, we're talking about the identification of the milk snake. Sometimes they have a V instead of a Y. All right, this one has more of a V than a Y as far as identification features. Other ID features for the milk snake, we can look at these dark borders on the saddles. These markings on the back are referred to as saddles or blotches, and typically they have this dark border. And you can see how this one has all the skin is very shiny compared to the ribbon snake. and it's very shiny like the ringneck. Both of these species have what we call smooth scales that don't have that that keel running down the middle. All right, so yeah, these are the specialists. Okay, that I believe wraps it up for me as far as what I wanted to share with you. I want to thank you all for hanging in. It was quite a long presentation. I really like you had lots of questions there, and I'm not sure I'm going to ask Nikki in terms of timing there, but certainly I'm willing to answer a few more questions if that's all right. But
yeah, so thank you so much, Josh. That was fantastic. I know I learned a lot, and from the questions and comments, it looked like everybody else did too. If we want to answer some more questions, I would limit it to about 4 or 5 minutes. And if anybody needs to sign off, feel free to, but I think we'll cut it at 8:30.
Okay. So yes, I'm happy to answer some questions. I'll just give you an email address if you do have questions that come up. I do teach some courses designed for people who are in or are going to maybe go into the environmental sector, about amphibian and reptile biology identification to help people with that, and also a course about monitoring amphibians and reptiles. So Josh at destinationconservation.ca. So you can go to that website, but you can also email me if you've got questions about amphibians and reptiles as they go on. Thank you very much for all the positive feedback on the presentations and your interactivity. I really enjoyed that. Janet, yes, smooth green snakes have smooth scales, not keeled scales. All right. All right, thank you, everybody. And if let's give a moment in case anybody has any more questions, but it looks like we're good to go. So here we go. Do you know, are red-sided garter snakes also found in Ontario? Yes. So the butlers in the eastern, the red-sided garter snake is a subspecies of the eastern. So it's the same species, Thamnophis sertalis, but it's a different subspecies. It's Thamnophis sertalis paritalis. All right. Janet, memories of Caño Palma. So you've been at Caño Palma? Did we 1990? Oh, Janet. So we were in Caño Palma in '99. That was my honeymoon. Yeah, that is awesome. Well, it's great to I guess connect at least electronically again. I didn't recognize the last name there, so but yeah, that was a lot of fun. And I miss Costa Rica. I've been down in Costa Rica almost every year since then. Right. Thank you, Karen, for your comments and feedback. I hope all is well, Janet. Yeah, great. Great. Daniel, you're welcome, Daniel. Okay. All right. Thank you, Carolyn. All right. Well, I guess there don't seem to be too many more questions, Nikki. So,
Yeah,
here's one from David. One more. How well is the eastern fox snake species faring? That's a good question, David. In southwestern Ontario, where it is occurring, it's doing relatively well, but it's still threats mostly from road mortality. And not as much from human persecution, but road mortality and habitat loss in southwestern Ontario. They're considered endangered there. Along the eastern shores of Georgian Bay, the populations are doing better, but they're under threat because of development for cottages, and so they're considered threatened along the Georgian Bay shore. So they're doing okay, but they're both populations in Ontario are listed, and we certainly are concerned about the southwestern Ontario populations. But they recently put in a really cool overpass in Windsor, specifically to allow fox snakes to cross that road. And so if it hadn't been for the widening and the expansion of the road from the bridge into the US and Canada, fox snakes would have been continued getting killed on that road, and the population would have been wiped out. And they created this beautiful overpass, prairie ecosystem that goes over the highway that now facilitates the fox snakes getting across safely, and they're using it. So there's some really amazing things that have been done in the Windsor area for fox snakes that is going to help those populations remain and even potentially recover and increase in size. Good question, David. All right. I think that'll wrap it up. Thanks again, everybody. Really appreciate it. And I'll hand it over to Nikki.
All right. Thank you so much, like Josh said, and he did put his email up there. So if you have any questions for him, you can go there. If you forget to write it down, you can always email outreach@oakridgesmoraine.org and ask me. I'm always happy to get you connected too. Again, thank you so much. All of your views help us do what we do. And we are very excited to hopefully do some outdoor things with you this summer, whether it's citizen science or anything like that. So hopefully we connect soon on another webinar or so. And I hope everyone has a good night. Bye now.
Thank you.